Is anyone here tonight for the first time in this series? Awesome. Thank you for coming. Welcome. My name is Dan Stone. If you don't know me, I'm the headmaster here at Dayspring. We are in week 3 of our lecture series on the U.S. Constitution. I'm going to go ahead and open with a word of prayer, and then we will get going. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your blessings to us. I thank you for this evening where we are able to gather together. Lord, I thank you for these folks who have given up of some of their time to come and learn about our Constitution and our country and some history. And Lord, I just pray that you'd bless this evening's lecture. I pray that it would be fruitful. I pray that it would be beneficial. Lord, we once again want to honor you with everything that we say and do. And so I pray all these things. Lord, I lift up Israel to you right now. Father, we pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We pray for the peace of Israel. Lord, I ask that you'd give their leaders wisdom. And Father, would you cause your righteousness and your will to be lifted up and help us to know how to pray and how to act in the meantime. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, if you missed it, week 1, we talked a lot about foundations. We talked a lot about philosophy, everyone's favorite topic. We talked about the groundwork that really was laid prior to the Constitution, and then did a kind of a brief history of what led to the creation of our Constitution. Last week was week 2, and we looked specifically, primarily at the legislative branch, which is Article 1 of the Constitution. So this week, our primary area of focus is going to be on Article 2, which is the executive branch. And then next week we will finish by talking about the rest of the Constitution, Articles 3 through 7. And then we will also talk about the Bill of Rights. And then we will also talk about the other amendments that we have not yet gotten to. So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about philosophy and progressivism, because I want to revisit a few things with the legislative branch. And then we're going to talk about how progressivism has really had an impact on the legislative branch. And then we're going to go into the executive branch and talk specifically about what the Constitution laid out or delegated for the executive branch. And then I'll come back to progressivism and how it has impacted the executive branch. And then we will, that'll be how we spend our evening. So it's going to be a little bit of back and forth, but I think you'll be able to keep track pretty well. I like this quote here from James Madison to start off our evening. And he says, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined." Try not to laugh. If only he could see it now. So, I want to review something, and this is a review about progressivism and its impact, but it's really, some of this is going to be new information. And this comes from a whole history lesson that I could give about American history in the 19th century. But I'm going to just try to summarize it by explaining briefly each of these bullet points. So to understand progressivism, which is right around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, you need to have a little bit of historical context. So as we get into post-Civil War America, what we have here is, first of all, the rise of universalism. So universalism is, and Daniel, if you tell me if this microphone, it's moving a little bit with me tonight because I don't stand still. If I need to tape it, just let me know. Just throw the tape at me and I'll try to catch it. All right, so universalism is basically all religions lead to God. So if you've ever heard of the Universalist Unitarian Church, these are very predominant in New England. You'll see their religious symbol, and it has a Star of David, it has the crescent moon of Islam, it has the yin-yang from Oriental culture, it has the cross of Christianity, it has all the religious symbols on it, and basically the idea there is that whatever path you are on to take you to whatever version of God you believe in is a good and right path. So universalism really began to make its way into American churches. And you can see a lot of churches today that a lot of them are closing their doors, but they don't have very large populations. But you'll see those things. There's actually one just down the street, but I won't call it out because I don't want to be unkind. Darwin's Origin of Species. So this was published in 1859, and it really began to take root in American culture, and especially in the academic realm. So that has a major impact on the 19th century. The industrialization of America. So from 1890 to 1920, we had about 40 million Americans come through Ellis Island in New York, Angel Island in San Francisco, and a few other ports of entry, but those are the two primary ones. And these immigrants were coming in by the millions, and they brought a lot of their culture and their religious beliefs with them. And so it changed America. And we're a country of a rich immigrant heritage. I mean, if you live on this continent, even if you're one of the what we would call a Native American, we're all immigrants. But when you get into American history, you study the effect that a lot of these immigrants had. Prior waves of immigration, they came from Western European countries. So the beliefs and the value system were very similar. These new immigrants is what they were called at the time. They came from Eastern and Southern Europe, and so they just a lot of the Greek Orthodox tradition, a lot of the Russian Orthodox tradition, and those things, the differences between what had become American Western ideas and what these immigrants brought with them was very different, and so that had an impact. Urbanization was a big part of this time period, so the growth of cities. We became a nation of big cities. Immigration, I think I'm repeating myself now. Oh, because I talked about industrialization. So the Industrial Revolution. So the steel industry, the oil industry. If you might have heard of them referred to as robber barons or captains of industry, depending on your view of people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Schwab and J.P. Morgan and those guys. All right, political corruption. There was a lot that our government was under what was called the spoils system. To the victor go the spoils. So when you get elected to office, the people who helped get you there, you pay them back with political appointments and jobs and licenses and things like that. And so that had begun from the local level all the way through to the federal level. There was a lot of corruption that really began to take root and become very normal as part of American politics during this time period. Education was having a major shift during this time period. We went from having education being very local in American history to education then becoming controlled by the state. And it was compulsory, and it was mandatory, and the state controlled. So there was the replacement of what's called the Western Christian Paideia, and that phrase comes from this book that I'm going to read to you just a small excerpt from this evening. It's called Battle for the American Mind. It was written by Pete Hegseth. He was a speaker at our Remember America speaker series in 2022, I believe, and I have read this book twice and listened to it on audiobook twice. It's quite good. The first half is very depressing. It talks about the progressive takeover of American education. The second half is very encouraging because it talks about how to fix what has happened, and that is through reclaiming education with the classical Christian model. When we met Pete Hegseth, we introduced him to the principle approach, and we just told him that the classical education model is awesome, but that's just because you don't know about the principle approach, which is even awesomer. He was impressed. Anyway, he talks a lot about the progressive takeover of education. There's a lot to go into with that. Suffice it to say that we think of the 1960s as being kind of the radical decade when things really began to shift in America. It goes back to the 1930s. There was a school of philosophers in Frankfurt, Germany. It's called the Frankfurt School. You can look it up. These people were Marxists, and they studied the theories of Karl Marx. But in the 1930s, a man in Germany rose to power named Adolf Hitler, and he was very much an anti-communist. He was a fascist. Communists are extreme left, fascists are extreme right. They wanted to expel all of the communists. Hitler rose to power in part by blaming all of Germany's problems on the Jews and the communists. So these communist philosophers and educators, they moved to America. They moved to New York City. And many of them embedded themselves into the Columbia University School of Education. The Columbia University School of Education was the main source for all of the teacher colleges that had risen up across the country. We talked about education becoming mandated and state-controlled. Teachers became professional. You had to go to college to get a teaching degree. Where did those colleges get all of their standards for how to train a teacher? From Columbia University. Where were they getting their information? From socialist, Marxist professionals who understood about uprooting all of the things that America was founded on. It was very systematic, it was very intentional, and it was very diabolical, and it was very successful. So education took a major change during this time period. And then religion, the division of the church. Just a quick synopsis here. I alluded to it in week 1, but in this progressive era, there was a real divide in Christianity, and conservatives and liberals in politics also became conservatives and liberals in religion. And what I mean by that is that there was this whole topic of caring for the poor and the needy. Conservative fundamental Christians, they started organizations like the Salvation Army in England that made its way over to America. The same with the YMCA. Just to give you an example, if you stayed at the YMCA as a young man, you had to agree to abide by a code of conduct. Okay, Water Street Rescue Mission, a local organization, they operate on a similar principle. If you're not familiar with them, they provide housing and food, but one of their stipulations is that you need to come to one of their church services. So this goes all the way back to this, that's kind of the way these missions have worked, is that if you're going to live at the Salvation Army as a young man, and we're going to train you and give you, help you with job and help you with housing, you have to abide by a code of conduct. Liberal Christians, liberal denominations of Christianity, they really began to focus on, they adopted this progressive idea that it's not our internal nature that makes us, it's the external factors. So that whole debate of the nature of man, is man basically good or basically evil? If man is basically good, then if he has the right education, if he has the right experiences, then he can be made, all those bad things about mankind can be made to be good. And so these liberal Christians, they began to adopt that mindset, and they criticized the fundamentalist Christians for trying to reform people's behavior. You can't legislate morality. You can't, they had really strict rules about drinking, and so there was this infighting among Christians about, well, stop worrying about what people are doing and instead of saying, well, let's feed their bellies and clothe their nakedness, and let's also minister to their souls, there was this split. And the fundamental church went underground all the way until about the 1970s. Roe v. Wade really woke up the church. But for decades then, the evangelical church just basically took a position that politics is not for the church. We don't get involved in politics. And then those liberal denominations of Christianity, they became progressive in their political ideology, and the government then became that agent that we look to for change, for reform, for bringing about equality, and then the new word later on became equity. So there's a lot there, and I've probably spent too much time on it already, but that's a little bit of a taste of how religion really was impacted significantly in the 19th century. So this all leads us up to this, just a continuation here, the change of the view of the nature of man. And here's how that affected government. Politicians of the progressive era, they believed that the complexities of the modern life gave rise to problems that cannot be addressed in the founding principles. The founding fathers were dealing with standing up to a tyrannical government. The people of the early 20th century, they're dealing with starvation and poor working conditions, being exploited by their employers, having tenement housing. The problems that the founding fathers faced and the solutions they came up with, those are no longer applicable or relevant to what we're dealing with here in the early 20th century. The founding purpose of government which is to protect people's natural-born rights, needs to change with the times. Government is now less of a danger to the governed than at the founding, and therefore it can be used as a change agent or a problem solver. And therefore, the checks and the balances that are built into the Constitution, according to the progressives, are outdated and they are obstacles to progress. President Woodrow Wilson said that there should be no limits on government. The state, actually, Wilson said, determines the rights and liberties of individuals, not nature. What did the Founding Fathers say? They said, the laws of nature and nature's God. That's in the Declaration of Independence. The laws of nature and nature's God. We are given life, liberty, and property, and it was written into the Declaration as the pursuit of happiness. Those are God-given rights. That's the Christian idea that founded America, that as an individual, I have rights because I'm an image bearer of Almighty God. I have a soul. And there are certain things that God gave me that only God can justifiably take away from me. Woodrow Wilson and the progressives of this era, they believed that the state is the one that knows best what rights people need. You'll hear Franklin Delano Roosevelt talk about the right to not going hungry, the right to having a job. Does this sound familiar? Do you hear people talk about rights today with a really broad range of what we are entitled to as rights? The right to health care, the right to education. That's it. That's one that a lot of us, even as Christians or conservatives, we might say, well, of course every child has the right to an education. If someone has a right to it, and our founding teaches us that if you have a right to something, then the government has an obligation to protect it, then if I have a right to education, what's the government's obligation to protect and maybe even provide for that education? We can get caught into this mindset as well of thinking that I have certain rights, but you have to follow that all the way to its logical conclusion and then ask yourself, do I want the government being in the position to provide that and regulate that? So the only difference between progressives and socialists, this is a paraphrase of something that comes out of this time period. And by the way, I mentioned a bunch of books last week. I would also recommend, I don't know if I recommended this, but Hillsdale College, raise your hand if you've heard of Hillsdale. They have online courses that are really, really good. They have one on the Constitution. It's called the Constitution 101. I would highly recommend. I rewatched that course as I've been going through this course in preparation, and this was one of the things I was reminded of and learned more about through Hillsdale, is that the only difference between progressives and socialists was one of policy. While socialists want to bring about ideals through revolution, progressives sought to do it incrementally. And then I want to finally remind you of Wilson's quote that I gave last week. It's in last week's notes about the Declaration being based on Newtonian law, so that being Isaac Newton, the laws of gravity. So he was saying that the Declaration was based on this old notion of things being fixed and finite. We need Darwinian thought. We need to understand that government and our Constitution evolve to change based on what the current populace needs for that moment. A very dangerous proposition. All right, so that leads us to the administrative state. Raise your hand if you've heard of the phrase, the administrative state. Okay. It's really a euphemism. It's accurate, but it's a phrase that we have used to come up with federal agencies. This is my definition. It's the term that's used to describe government agencies that are created by Congress or the executive branch, and they are tasked with the creation and the enforcement and the judgment of their own laws or rules or regulations. Now, think about the three components there: creation, enforcement, and judgment. What are those three things that we've talked about? Those are the three. Go ahead, you can talk. the three branches of our government, right? These agencies have all three of those powers in one agency. I don't think I have to go into much more detail for you folks who are very smart to realize that that's a dangerous thing. There are over 439 agencies. I started to print a list. It was 22 pages long, so I just told the printer to give me pages 1 through 4 because I don't want to waste paper. Some of the agencies may sound new to you. Some of them are very familiar. The Agriculture Department, Department of Agriculture, that's one of the agencies of the administrative state. Under the Agriculture Department, we have the Advocacy and Outreach Office. We have the Agricultural Marketing Service. We have the Agricultural Research Service. We have Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. I'll move on. Under the Forest, we have the Forest Service, National Agricultural Library, National Agricultural Statistics Service, National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Let's go back to the A's here. We have the Air Transportation Stabilization Board. Ever heard of that one? Created by an executive order of George W. Bush about 2 weeks after 9/11/01. A whole agency created with one executive order, and they have all kinds of authority and power over flight, over our air traffic. The Amtrak Reform Council, that was a good one. Founded in 1997, and by 2002, they finally released the report that they were tasked to create. It only took them 5 years. My students might want me to give them more time to turn their assignments in, but we don't give them 5 years. All right, that was just mostly a joke. So that's the administrative state. It's a basic rejection of the separation of powers and limited government. They base policy and implementation on, it's supposed to be, on disinterested scientific and technical expertise. This is the antithesis of constitutional government. And here was the rationale for the creation of the administrative state. From Woodrow Wilson to FDR, we see that the growth of America, they believed, the progressives, outgrew the Constitution of our country. Regular people elected to office were ill-equipped to run the country. We needed a ruling class of experts. You read about that in The Battle for the American Mind. Hegseth talks about John Dewey, the father of progressive education. One of the things that it's all there. It's easy to get. It's public information. They didn't hide the ball. He wrote openly about public education for the masses really only needing to produce a workforce that could take their place in the industrial factory or in a white-collar job where they just sat at a desk and executed the tasks from a manual all day long. College education, higher level education, that was for the elite, the few. Okay? So this was very much a part of the progressives' agenda, was that we just need a population that can sort of take their spot as the cog in the machine. We need the ruling people to be the ones to make all the decisions. So these agencies that are created, these bureaucracies that are created, they are going to be run by people who make this their life's work. They're going to become experts at what they do, and then they're going to be the ones who will actually run the government. Okay? Now, let me give a little caveat. I think it's unreasonable to think that Congress could pass laws that would regulate everything that needs to be regulated. So there's obviously a need for some level of administrative executive action. So I'm not saying that everything OSHA does, OSHA is part of the administrative state. Obviously, OSHA serves its purpose and has I'm glad to know that when I go to a restaurant that there's been some sort of quality control over the food, and it's not likely to get me sick because they've followed rules that experts have identified as being important. Does that make sense? So I'm not saying we abolish the administrative state. I'm not saying that all those things are bad and they need to be abolished. But I think it's important for us to understand where the administrative state came from, where those bureaucracies came from, and the danger is that they have all three powers of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, all within one body, and they're not elected. They're unelected. They're supposed to be accountable to Congress and the president. We'll talk about that a little bit later. One of the thoughts that you can read about from the progressives is that we threw out the Articles of Confederation in 1787. It wasn't working. We threw it out. We can do the same with the Constitution now. Separation of powers leads to gridlock and inefficiency, which I would suggest to you that's what the founders wanted. They didn't want laws passed. The Constitution has rules in it about how mandating that Congress get together at least once a year. You heard that right. The Constitution actually says that Congress has to get together at least one time a year. They never thought that it would become a full-time job as a career for somebody, that they would be in operation for 9 to 10 months out of the year, passing hundreds of laws a year. That was never the idea. Administrative state functions, as I said, in all three roles of government. I already said there's 439 agencies. Let me just give you a little bit of a little more context here for progressive logic. In 1519, the Spanish conqueror Cortés famously burned his own ships off the coast of Mexico to remove any temptation to return to Cuba. Around 1900, the progressives effectively scuttled the very idea that we should look to the past for insights about anything, certainly for education or government. Progressives built a history-phobic value system into our social studies mindset. Old is yesterday. Old is irrelevant. Old is outdated. Progressives sunk the very idea that we could or should look to the past for insights about how to live or learn. This is why few, if any, modern public or Christian schools study much history before America's founding. The progressive logic is simple. Society is evolving. As with biological evolution, society is improving over time. Older wisdom is as primitive as extinct fossils. During the progressive era, engines propelled us faster than horses. Telecommunication infrastructure seemed miraculous. Medicine healed. Our command of nature progressed. Systems of global transportation were established, and great wealth resulted. This made it easy for the progressives to support their position. Ideas and events of the past were the works of backward, inferior intellects who weren't yet enlightened as we are. Our forefathers were racist and sexist after all. The further back in history you go, the more this is true, or so the progressives claimed. Like the wake behind a great ocean liner, we have no reason to dwell on our past, or its art, or its literature. These smooth and dissipate as we move ever forward. Progressives believe that by looking forward, democracy can become a tool for government progress rather than government restraint. So one more note about the administrative state before we get back to the actual Constitution. As I said, there are over 439 agencies. It was mentioned last week, so I did a little bit of digging to remind myself and educate myself. Chevron USA versus Natural Resources Defense Council. This was a 1984 Supreme Court case. It became known as colloquially as Chevron deference. And basically, it said that if an agency interpreted a constitutional statute, the court should defer to the agency rather than try to interpret law. This was overturned recently, actually back in the summer, in Loper Bright Enterprises v. Raimondo, allowing judges to interpret the law rather than defer to the agency. Let me give you an example. There was a case a couple of years ago that also got decided on this summer by our current Supreme Court. There was a couple, I believe it was in Idaho, and they bought some property, and that property had a small stream on it, and they wanted to backfill that stream with soil so that they could build a building. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, one of the agencies of the administrative state, told them that they could not. And if they did, they would be fined $40,000 per day. The EPA claimed that this authority came from a law that gave the EPA, it has to do with America's waterways. This is a stream that fed to a small creek, that fed to a river, that fed to one of the protected waterways. So the EPA interpreted the law to the most extreme level so that it basically applied to what amounted to a small puddle in someone's backyard on their own private property. That has happened a lot, and then the courts rule in favor of the EPA. Chevron deference said that the judges ruling here have to defer to what the EPA interprets as the law, and our Supreme Court this past summer said that's no longer true. The courts can now interpret the law and make a determination as to whether or not the EPA has violated that law or whether that law is to be upheld. Does that make sense? So that's an extreme example, but it's actually, well, it's not extreme. It's only extreme in the sense that it is unthinkable that somebody could be fined that level of money for something that's so small. But that's the administrative state, and that's some of the way that we see it played out today. So, one more note on Congress, going back to Article 1 before we jump into Article 2 for this evening. The 17th Amendment is a crucial piece of our history. This is where we have the direct election of senators. So, originally, the Founding Fathers put it in place that at the federal level, the House of Representatives was the only one directly chosen by the people. The Senate was chosen by the states. So until 1913, Pennsylvania, we would elect our state leaders and we would elect one member of Congress from our home district. Those state leaders would meet in Harrisburg and they would choose two people to go represent us in Washington, D.C. as our U.S. senators. In 1913, that was overturned. The amendment changed that so that it's now popular election. So in less than it's in about a month, a little over a month, we're going to go vote, and this year we have a choice of senators. We can vote for Bob Casey or Dave McCormick or a third party or write-in candidate. But we get to vote on the senator this year. And here's the reason why that was a detrimental thing for our country according to conservative teaching. The Founding Fathers, remember their view on democracy as being mob rule. They believed that in Congress, that if the House was directly chosen by the people and the Senate was chosen by the states, the Senate would check the passions of the mob. Remember, they were very fearful of the tyranny of the majority. And so the idea was that a law will never make it to the president's desk to get signed if it's not a good bill, because the people's house, they can pass whatever they want, but the Senate, you will have had to have done something with your life to be a senator. That was the idea. That you don't become a senator unless you have had some level of accomplishment and you're chosen by your state. And so those people have a higher level of sophistication and a higher level of achievement, and therefore they will act as a check on any bad bills that the House tries to put forward. And now that check has been removed. Okay? The filibuster then is really the last check to the House and the Senate becoming really a democracy. The filibuster, very, very quickly, any time that a bill comes on the Senate floor, it requires what's called cloture. A cloture vote is a two-thirds vote, or 60%. So they can debate the bill, but at some point somebody has to recommend cloture, and then 60 of those 100 senators have to vote on the bill have to vote for the debate to end and for the bill to come to the floor for the actual vote. And so in the past few decades, Republicans and Democrats, neither one of them has had a majority that was more than 55 or 56 senators, and so the filibuster is really is a tool that has been used to require more than just a simple majority to pass laws. We've seen exceptions to this, but the filibuster is still in place. One of the most scary things from a conservative standpoint about this upcoming election is that one candidate is in favor of abolishing the filibuster. If the filibuster is abolished for all legislation, Puerto Rico will become a state, Washington, D.C. will become a state. That will be 4 more senators for the Democrat Party. And there's a whole host of other pieces of legislation. They may actually be able to add 4 or 5 justices to the current Supreme Court, which would all then be appointed by the current president, whoever that happens to be. So the filibuster, in case you don't pay close attention to politics, if you hear the filibuster come up, just know that people who are conservative in their political beliefs, they look at the filibuster as being like one of the last things that's still in place. That wasn't put in place by the founders, by the way. That was put in place by senators pretty early on. But it was the idea there was that it would prove as a check to the House. And so there's a lot of people who fear the filibuster going away. All right, Article 2. If you will open your pocket constitutions to page 9, we're going to read from Article 2. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but also flip over to your outline. If you have a Constitution outline, we're going to talk quickly through the executive branch. Let me get my copy of the outline. I don't have it memorized. Don't tell my students. All right, the executive branch, Article 2. Remember, we go from article to section to clause. So A, S, and C is how we track things in the Constitution. Article 2, Section 1, the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years, and together with the Vice President chosen for the same term, be elected as follows. So if you look at your outline, I've condensed the Constitution. These are my notes for your use. Section 1, the executive power is vested in a president. He holds office for a 4-year term, and he is elected by the Electoral College. And here's how the Electoral College works. Each state is given a certain number of electors that are based on how many members they have in Congress. So every state gets at least 3 votes in the Electoral College. 1 for their 1 minimum House member and 2 for their 2 senators. Alaska has 3 electoral votes. Wyoming has 3. California has 54. 2 senators and then 52 representatives in Congress. Okay, Pennsylvania has 19. What happens then is, in every state except 2, which are Maine and Nebraska, it's winner take all. So whoever wins the majority of the votes in Pennsylvania will get all 19 of Pennsylvania's electoral votes. And it's that way for 48 of the 50 states. Maine has 5 electoral votes, and they're broken into 3 districts, they're congressional districts, and they go by district. Whoever wins the popular vote in those districts will win, and it's the same thing for Nebraska. Nebraska has 4. One of their districts is the state capital where the university is. That district always goes blue, and the rest of the state goes red. But all the other states, it's winner take all. Do you have a question?
Yeah, you're kind of skipping a step though, in that it's still electors in the electoral college.
Yes.
In other words, when you say wins, the fact of the matter is you're not voting on the electors.
Right. Yeah, you're voting for electors who are chosen ahead of time by their parties. That's like really behind the scenes.
By the candidate
Yeah.
that you elect, he gets to choose the electors.
Right. Yeah, I wasn't going to go that deep into the weeds.
They really can vote,
They can.
if they are unloyal to the person who sent them.
And when they do, they're called faithless electors. So yeah, the Electoral College is actually people who, they take an oath saying they will do a certain thing, but there's nothing legally that says they have to. So Harris could win all of Pennsylvania's, but all of her electors could go and pull the lever for Trump if they wanted to. It's never happened that a whole state has flipped that way, but one example was Washington State. I think they have 9 electoral votes, and one of those electors in the 2020 election voted for some third-party person. And so Biden only got actually 8 of Washington's 9 electoral votes. So those are called faithless electors. So, but to keep it simple, for the average person, if Trump wins the majority of votes in Pennsylvania, he will get Pennsylvania's 19 electoral votes. Someone has to get a majority, by the way. So the majority currently is 270. Okay? So 538 votes are in the Electoral College. That's 535 plus 3 for Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. does not get members of Congress. They do not get senators, but they do get 3 electoral votes. So there are 435 members of Congress, 100 senators, plus 3 of Washington, D.C., and a majority plus 1 of 538 is 270. So if nobody gets 270, if there was ever a third candidate who put up a good enough fight, or it is actually mathematically possible for there to be a 269-269 tie, then the vote goes to the House. The House of Representatives then chooses the president, and that's not based on the 435 members of the House. Each state gets 1 vote. So Pennsylvania's 17 members of the House would cast their votes, and if it's 12 Republicans and 5 Democrats in Pennsylvania, then Pennsylvania would cast its 1 vote for the Republican candidate. That has actually happened twice, 1824 and 1876, where nobody received a majority, so the House chose the President of the United States. Am I nerding out too much here? Okay. All right, number 3. Qualifications to be the president: you have to be a natural-born citizen, you have to be 35 years old, and you have to be a 14-year resident of the United States. Number 4, the vice president gets the power of the president if the president is unable to perform his duties for any reason. We'll talk about the 25th Amendment in a few minutes. And then number 5, the president shall receive compensation for his job, but that compensation can either be raised or decreased during his term. So if Congress wants to change the president's salary right now, they can, but it will not affect Biden. It will take place for the next president who comes in, either a pay decrease or a pay raise. I don't know if a pay decrease has ever happened. All right. And then number 6 details out the presidential oath of office. So that's Section 1 of Article 2. Section 2 is the duties of the president. The president is the commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy. He can grant reprieves and pardons to all except federal officials who have been impeached. With Senate approval, he can make treaties and nominate ambassadors and judges of the Supreme Court and underline other federal officials, if you are a note taker. That other federal officials is going to be interpreted pretty broadly for this administrative state discussion and the growth of the presidential cabinet. All right? Section 3, he shall from time to time give the Congress information on the state of the Union. For many, many decades, this was a letter written by the president, not even once a year, sometimes just periodically, a letter to Congress, updating Congress on the state of the Union. Probably around the 1970s, it became a nationally televised address that typically happens in January of non-election years, and it's the dog and pony show that political junkies can't help, like myself, can't help but watch, even though it's super irritating because he gets 5 words out and they clap, and the left side stands up and the right side boos and hisses, and it was really entertaining when it's been entertaining in recent years with our most 2 recent presidents, let's put it that way. It just takes forever and a day to get through a speech. Section 4 deals with impeachment, okay? I want to just briefly talk through the amendments to Article 2 of the Constitution. So these amendments have all impacted what the Constitution originally laid out for the president. The 12th Amendment changed the Electoral College process to vote for a president and a vice president separately. For the first 3 elections of our country's history, the vice president was the runner-up, and they quickly realized that was not a good idea. There were no political parties when we first started. The first political divide was over the Bill of Rights, but once Washington was inaugurated, the first real divide was over the issue of a national bank, and the 2 political parties formed very quickly, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And again, I said this in week 1, that really came down to how you interpret the Constitution. Do you interpret the Constitution very strictly, or do you interpret it very broadly? And that's been really the basis of the political parties ever since then. But what happened then was when John Adams became president in 1797, his vice president was his political enemy, Thomas Jefferson. And then when Thomas Jefferson beat John Adams in the election of 1800, he became president, and his enemy was Aaron Burr. His political opponent was Aaron Burr. So Aaron Burr became his vice president. And then in 1804, the sitting vice president killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. So they realized this whole like having a president and vice president be from opposing political parties, not a great idea. So they amended that with the 12th Amendment. The 20th Amendment then is nicknamed the Lame Duck Amendment. The lame duck period is the time between an election and inauguration. So President Biden has an upcoming lame duck period because he's not going to be president in the new term, okay? Unless, wouldn't that be funny? Anyway. So from November 5th until January 20th is considered Biden's lame duck period. I don't know where the phrase lame duck came from, but basically he's on his way out, but he's still technically in charge. That used to be from November to March. March 4th was the inauguration day for presidents all the way up until 1932. And what happened was, in 1932, Herbert Hoover lost his re-election bid to Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, and FDR wanted to get in office and enact his policies very, very quickly because we had begun the Great Depression. And so they decided to shorten that lame duck period so that new presidents would be able to get into office faster. So it's January 20th at 12 noon, even if January 20th is on a Sunday, that is when the president takes the oath of office. And it also establishes that January 3rd is inauguration day for new members of Congress. So Congress will reconvene on January 3rd of 2025 with whoever has been recently elected or re-elected. They will take the oath of office, and then on January 20th, the new president will take the oath of office. All right, turn the page. The 22nd Amendment established term limits for the president. This was passed after FDR had run and been elected to 4 terms. He died and about a couple months into his 4th term, but he was elected to 4 terms, and the American people in Congress said, let's not do that again. So they passed an amendment that said the president can only serve for 2 terms or a maximum of 10 years. So if President Biden were to step away or God forbid, die, and Kamala Harris would become president now, she could serve out the remainder of this term and then still be eligible to run for 2 more terms because we're in the second half of Biden's term, if that makes sense. All right? Letter D, the 25th Amendment. This is known as the Presidential Succession Amendment. It spells out that the vice president succeeds the president upon death, resignation, or incapacity. When the vice president becomes president, he nominates a new vice president, and that is confirmed by a majority of both houses of Congress. This has only happened once when Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, resigned. Nixon nominated Gerald Ford, House Minority Leader. Both chambers confirmed him. He became the vice president, and then when Nixon resigned, Ford became president. And then Ford pardoned Nixon, and everybody said that was a corrupt bargain, and it probably cost Ford the election of 1976. I'm getting too much into the weeds. Number 3, the vice president acts as the president when the president cannot execute his duties temporarily. So an example of this would be a medical procedure. The first time I read about this, I remember it was George W. Bush. He needed to have a colonoscopy. So, talk about maintaining dignity. He had to sign an executive order delegating all powers to Dick Cheney until further notice. He went under anesthesia for his colonoscopy. When he came back out, he resumed his powers. But for a couple of hours there, Dick Cheney was acting president of the United States. And that happens pretty routinely these days when a president needs to have a medical procedure, as one example. Removal of a president, the 25th Amendment does provide for a president to be removed if his vice president and a majority of the cabinet submit it in writing to the president pro tempore of the Senate. That currently, by the way, I put it in the notes for you, is Washington Senator Patty Murray. She is the current president pro tem of the Senate. And so this allows for the president to be removed by his vice president and cabinet if they deem that to be necessary. So you might have heard people refer to that back in 2020, people calling on Mike Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment on Donald Trump. I've heard it plenty in the past year for people to call on Kamala Harris to invoke the 25th Amendment for our current president. I'm not sure that it came up a lot before that, but it certainly has come up in recent years. And then I just put in here, this is not part of the amendments, but the Presidential Succession Act was passed by Congress and the President in 1947, and you may have heard of these regulations, but it's not in the constitutional amendments. It's actually in a law, and it provides for succession for the President basically in case of a nuclear war. You look at the timing, it was 1947. The idea was, what if we have a nuclear war and the President and Vice President are both taken out at the same time? So Harry Truman actually proposed this law to put elected officials ahead of cabinet officials. So President Truman, this was an interesting move. He decided that if he and the Vice President both get taken out, rather than have that go immediately to the cabinet who have not been elected, let's at least have 2 steps in there where it goes to elected officials before then going to cabinet. So the Speaker of the House is number 3 in line, President Pro Tem is number 4 in line, and then it goes to the cabinet positions in order of age of how long that cabinet position has existed. And the first one created was State, and then we go to Treasury, and then we go to War, which is now Defense, and we move on from there. So that's Article 2 of the Constitution and the amendments that affect it. I want to talk just really briefly here in closing about some of the ways that the executive branch functions today. So the cabinet. The Constitution gives the president the authority to nominate and with the, quote, advice and consent of the Senate to appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, and judges of the Supreme Court and all other officers of the United States. So a little history lesson here. The first cabinet, Washington, it was an interesting story of how this even came to be. So Washington read the Constitution, and it talked about getting advice and consent from the Senate. Washington went to he actually, there was a story where he went to the senators, a group of senators, to ask for their advice and consent. And he was talking about, I think it was a neutrality issue with Great Britain, and the senators all refused to speak. He was asking for their input. Some of them might have been intimidated by him. This was a new government. It's like, have you ever had one of those conversations with your boss where you're saying, wait, you're telling me you want me to be honest right now, but do you if I really am honest right now, is that going to come back to bite me? If you ever had one of those experiences, that's kind of the way the senators were feeling at this point. So they were really quiet. Washington got really ticked. He raised his voice at them and stormed out of the room. And he never went back to the senators again for advice and consent. He then exclusively went to his cabinet members. The approval of the Senate for the cabinet was intended to prevent the president from having closed-door meetings with unelected and unaccountable advisors. So the whole premise of the cabinet was the president's going to need advisors, he's going to need people as part of the executive branch, but we don't want it to just be his drinking buddies or his Ivy League classmates, to use a modern example. We want it to be people that actually have some level of accountability. They've at least been voted on by the Senate. That's who the president should be going to get advice from. So our first cabinet was Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, State Secretary Thomas Jefferson, War Secretary, which is now the Department of Defense, was Henry Knox. He was an artillery officer in Washington's army. And then the first Attorney General was Edmund Randolph. He was a Virginia politician. Finally, for tonight, I'll just leave you with this, and then we can discuss, or you can ask questions if you'd like. This is coming, again, pulling a little bit from the Hillsdale course here on the Constitution. The problem with the executive branch today is that, first of all, it's unconstitutional, and actually it's more accurate to say that it's pre-constitutional. And what that means is that it actually goes back to the nature of government before we had the Constitution. Governments before the Constitution of the United States, it was based on the whim of a king or nobles or parliament or people who were at some level not accountable to the electorate. And then might not even have been an electorate, depending on which country you're talking about. So I gave you the example of the EPA. I have a few other examples here. Let me consult my notes. Another example here, President Obama in 2010. Obama, in his first 2 years, he was really pushing hard for a cap-and-trade agreement. Do you remember the cap-and-trade discussion back in 2010? It has to do with environmental regulations. And it was on the docket in 2010, working its way through the congressional committee process, and then the 2010 midterm elections happened, and Republicans regained control of the House of Representatives in the 2010 elections. When asked about the cap-and-trade agreement then, the cap-and-trade deal, President Obama famously said, well, there's more than one way to skin that cat. So what he did was, he couldn't get cap-and-trade passed through Congress the traditional way, so he used the EPA to begin enacting some regulations that were in the cap-and-trade deal that Congress couldn't pass. So a president can bypass Congress and put certain things into action using the administrative state. Another example is some people, some scholars, will criticize former President Trump for his tariff policies. That Congress should have authority over tariffs, but President Trump is pretty tariff happy. He liked them in his first term, and he's proposing them in his second term. Some people would look at that and say, that's actually not constitutional. Tariffs should be something that run through Congress. But if he's going to use the administrative state, then that's part of this topic. So it's unconstitutional, it's pre-constitutional, and the second thing is that it's an oligarchy. It's a self-selecting elite that's based on their education and their technical expertise. And there's sort of this many of these people are self-selecting. They run in the same circles. They all go to the same colleges and universities. They all come from the same parts of the country. They all go to the same dinner parties and cocktail parties. They all have a passion for whatever part of the government that they serve in. They are this elite group of people. They are appointed by elected officials, but once they're appointed, there's actually some statutes, depending on the agency, that Congress and the president don't even have oversight over some of these agencies and have the ability to remove them. So they're totally unaccountable, on top of having never been elected in the first place. The use of the budget process is used to pass laws. The Affordable Care Act was passed through something called reconciliation. So reconciliation is something that the administrative state can use, again, to bypass the legislative process. Agencies can make rules. Another example would be the contraception mandate as part of the Affordable Care Act. If you remember the contraceptive mandate, it was a Catholic organization that sued the federal government to say that the Department of Health and Human Services was trying to mandate that employers provide birth control contraceptives that go against Catholic teaching. They're not allowed to, that's not even in the Affordable Care Act that mandate can happen, but a government agency that can make its own rules, enforce its own rules, impose fines, or even potential jail time, depending on what the rule is. And then when you have a hearing with them, they're a self-perpetuating body. You have to go before them to let them decide if they interpret their rule the way that they think they should interpret their rule. You have no recourse. You have no due process. Once in a while, somebody with enough money and time and desire will take on the federal government, and it will go to the Supreme Court like it did in Chevron deference. But a lot of times, people who have these regulations placed on them, these mandates, these rules placed on them, they have no recourse. And the final example that I could think of was OSHA using their governmental authority, their governmental authorization to impose the COVID vaccine on certain federal employees. And that had to go to the Supreme Court, and it was struck down. Okay? So these are just some real-life examples, and again, OSHA is a great example because I think that in there's lots of examples where OSHA and its existence has made life better for people and made work more safe. And so I don't mean to say that these things all need to be done away with, but I want to point them out because we're studying about the Constitution and the original intent, and I think it's important for us to understand the dangers that we live under because of the administrative state. The more aware of it we are, the more we can look out for it, and there may be times where we are the ones who actually have to stand up and say, no, we're not going to participate in that. We're going to fight back against that. The last thing I'll say for tonight, and then I'll open it up for questions, is this is just my opinion, what I'm about to say, so take it for what it's worth. But for me, as a history teacher, the reason that I have always been such a hawk on original intent, I believe that that's the way we are intended to interpret Scripture. So it's just part of the way I think. I believe that when we read God's Word, we are supposed to understand it from the perspective of the author and the audience. The author to the original audience. That's one of the reasons that I've been so blessed. We take our seniors to Israel when there's not war. We were able to go to Greece last year, but one of the things that we focus in on is you go to these places, you understand the Bible you understand the Bible differently because you're in the original place where it was written, and you're learning about the people to whom it was written, and you just understand it better. It's just as relevant for us today, but our understanding is more pure when we understand who wrote it and who the audience was for and what were the undergirding principles at play. And I think it's the same thing with the Constitution. I'm not saying the Constitution is at the same level as the Bible. I'm just saying as a general framework, the Constitution was and is a remarkable document. It was founded on biblical and Christian ideas. And the closer we can get to living under the Constitution as it was originally intended to be, the more freedom I believe we will have. So, there's Article 2, the executive branch, and a whole lot about progressivism and the administrative state. Next week we'll finish up. But for tonight, what questions do you have? Or comments? Yes? I believe there are 15 members of the presidential cabinet. The vice president is considered part of the cabinet, and then there's, in addition to the original 5, there's agriculture, aging, Veterans Affairs, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security. There's like 12 of them. And then there are other people that are technically part of the cabinet, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and a few other appointed positions that don't have a department under them, but they are, when the president gathers the cabinet, there's 15 plus the president in attendance. And in most recent case, plus the president's wife. I can't help it, I'm sorry. Yep. Again, it comes back. Yeah, I mean, it comes back to how you view the Constitution. Do you view the Constitution as a document that's meant to be interpreted closely and tightly and originally? And when you see the general welfare clause, that Congress can enact laws that they think are necessary and proper to promote the general welfare, what's your understanding of welfare, general welfare? Because that will determine then how you view what should happen in the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton thought the Constitution gave broad powers. That's why he said, let's do a national bank. Thomas Jefferson said, no, there's nothing in the Constitution about a national bank. Are you kidding me? It was corrupt in England. That's what we just fought against. Hamilton said, we need a national bank because we need to have financial stability. And the Constitution gives us authority, broad authority. So from the get-go, that was the argument. So if you're asking me my opinion, I think I've established that I'm a strict constructionist, but lots of other people see it differently, and they always have. So, sorry to be like a politician answering your question, but that's the way it is. Yes? Yeah. Did she fill it out? Just kidding. She could have. Yeah. To be honest, I don't have any memory of this broad mail-in voting season before COVID. My understanding was that absentee ballots had a limited, you had to apply for one and you had to meet certain qualifications. I don't know if there was a broad provisions for mail-in voting before 2020. If there were, I was not aware of them. But I know that they were greatly expanded during 2020, and COVID was the excuse that was used. Yeah.
There was actually, in Pennsylvania, there's actually legislation before COVID, they had passed legislation to expand mail-in balloting to beyond but then, when COVID happened, then certain people within government pushed it beyond even what the legislation prohibitive changes were, but the judges then didn't stand by the law, and they started saying, oh yeah, you can do this, you can do that, even though it's not in the law.
Yeah.
Which is, well, it's kind of like, that's the unfortunate thing, when this progressive idea happens, and people start thinking that, well, it has to be a living, breathing document. Well, if it's a living, breathing document, and the person in power can say it means whatever it wants, then you don't have any protection at all.
Right. Yes, I mean, generally, yes. I'm not going to claim that there are any. And the other thing I'll say is that all voting laws are specific to each state. So states are allowed to enact their own voting laws. That's why certain states have restricted things, certain states have opened things wide up, and Pennsylvania is one of the states that I feel like we had some shady things happening here in 2020, and we had 4 years to fix it, and I don't think we fixed it. Yeah, I'm not as knowledgeable on that, and I'm not aware of it from before 2020. There was another hand back here. Yes, sir. Yes. The FBI is under the Attorney General's office, which is part of the presidential cabinet, and they do have some laws that Congress has made, so they kind of answer to both. But if you're asking me how that's going to get corrected, well, that's above my pay grade. But yeah. At the FBI, if reforms are needed, Secret Service would be another one. That has to come from Congress and the President, and the Office of the President are going to have to do that, and or Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to have to start getting involved. But then again, the case has to be brought to the court, and that's a long process. By the time a case gets to the Supreme Court, it's 4 or 5 years old on average. So, yeah, Keith.
I was just going to point out that how interesting this is. We're in an election year, and when you look at the Constitution and the role of the president's role, he's the chief executive of the country.
Yeah.
He's supposed to execute the law, and yet you would never guess that to watch campaigning. You would think he's the king of the country.
Yeah.
He's talking about all the time about that that's where we have the debate. That we should be looking, let's see, an executive who actually, because that's his actual job,
Right.
is the business of government, you know. Who would
Execute the
make sense
laws.
to be the chief executive of the country? Somebody who has experience executing business, or somebody who has no experience executing
Yeah.
business? So
Yeah, there's a whole...
we've seen that in many elections, that we just ignore what the role of the president is.
That really goes back to FDR. Wilson is the first progressive president, and he's the one who really flips the idea that the Constitution should be living and should be adjustable to the current situation. By the time we get to FDR, about 25 years later, and he runs on the New Deal, the country's in the Depression, FDR comes to office with a whole slate of legislative proposals that he gives to Congress. And it's a complete inversion of the way things had been done up to that point. Congress is supposed to make the laws and then send them to the president's desk. From FDR to every president since then, think about the elections. They run on an agenda, and they have an agenda of things that they want to get done. That's what's in the State of the Union every year. The state of our union is strong, yay! And then they lay out the next hour and a half is what I'm going to be sending to Congress this year. I'm going to be sending this to Congress. It's a complete inversion, but that's what we've grown over time to expect from our presidents. And I should have talked about the Electoral College. I talked about the filibuster and the 17th Amendment. Just as a note about the Electoral College, if we lose the Electoral College and the president is chosen by popular vote, 40 of our 50 states literally will not matter when it comes. So what's going to happen if in this election, if Trump is able to win this election, he's likely to lose the popular vote, but win the Electoral College, which is what he did in 2016. It's what George W. Bush did in 2020. So you're going to hear a lot of people talk, if that happens, you're going to hear a lot of people talk about, we need to abolish the Electoral College. The will of the people is being ignored. Yes, it is. And that's the way the founders wanted it. They had the foresight to understand that the president is too important to simply be chosen by a popular majority, because popular majorities can't be trusted. Because if a majority of the people vote to steal your property, they can do it, but that doesn't make it moral. It really matters how we think about things. Logical, critical thinking, principled thinking is really important. So it's one of the best things the founders gave us. Of all the things they gave us, the Electoral College ensures that at least 28 to 30 of the states matter. There are flyover states for sure, but one of the things the Electoral College gives us is that you really have to cobble together a coalition of the populace in order to become president, and that's a protection that it happens to benefit Republicans in today's world and probably for the past few decades. But I'd like to think I would say it's the same thing if the shoe was on the other foot, because it's a matter of principle. So, yes.
So they put term limits on the president.
Yes.
Do you know at that time they discussed the term limits on the House and Senate?
I'm not aware of any discussion during that amendment for term limits on the president. I'm not aware of any discussion that also took place for putting term limits on senators or members of the House. I wish there would have been. That convention of states that I talked about, of people who want to call for a convention of states, that's one of the most important, that's one of the top things on their agenda, is to have term limits for all federally elected officials. And that's one of the progressive agenda right now, is to put term limits on the Supreme Court. Because currently the Supreme Court is a conservative court, and so during this current tenure, the call is for term limits on the Supreme Court. But the Constitution, which we'll talk about next week, judges are a lifetime appointment on good behavior. Another brilliant check that the founders put in. That sometimes works to the disadvantage. If there's a liberal justice, there's a part of me that says, man, it'd be great if that person would resign. I mean, I'd never wish someone to die, but it'd be great for them to resign. But you have to, it's like free speech means that people are free to say things that might be offensive to me, but I believe free speech is important. Having judges that have lifetime appointments is important, whether it's a liberal or a conservative judge. So, all right. Yes?
In Article 2, it talks about the oath of office.
Yes.
I've often been conflicted about that.
Okay.
Wonderful oath of office, but it seems like it's more formality than anything to do. I mean, it says here that they will preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Is there any way that anything can happen to somebody that violates the oath of office?
It has to be an impeachment by the House and then a removal by the Senate. And the removal by the Senate it has to be a 2/3 majority, so 67 senators have to agree. Yep. Yeah, and I will uphold the Constitution. What does the Constitution say is my job as president? To execute the laws. So presidents, left and right, who have selectively chosen which laws they're going to enforce and which ones they're not going to, they're violating their oath of office. But the policy or the procedure that's put in place is the impeachment process, and presidents have been impeached, but no one's ever been removed from office. It takes a high threshold, but that's a good thing, because we don't want 51 senators to be able to remove a president from office. No president would ever be safe if that was the standard. So, anything else? You will get home in plenty of time for the vice presidential debate. Or if you're like my wife, you're going to go running, screaming for the hills, anything but that. Thank you, folks, for coming, and have a great night. And Lord willing, see you next week.